Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth Europe Jazz Network webinar in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So the title of the today webinar is How Long Has This Been Going On? And our topic today is an historic overview of the music sector after the big crises of the past, like the past pandemics, the World War I, the World War II, and the 9/11, and other big financial crisis like 2008 and 1929. So the big questions today are, first, has history taught us anything? And then, how did the cultural sector react after this big crisis? So today with us, we have three brilliant and great professionals and experts who will tell us more about that. So we have François Matarasso, who is an independent writer and researcher from the UK. We have Francesco Martinelli, who is a teacher and researcher of history of jazz from Italy. And we have George McKay, professor of media studies at the University of East Anglia in the UK. So now I'm going to ask each of them to give a quick rundown of who they are and what they do. So to start with, I would like to ask François Matarasso to introduce himself shortly.
Thank you, Francesca. My name is François Matarasso. I'm a community artist. I've been making art and culture with communities in the UK and in other European countries since the early 1980s. And over that time became increasingly interested in the issues that raised by the work and have done a lot of research into that area. Last year, I published a book called A Restless Art with the somewhat cheeky subtitle, How Participation Won and Why It Matters. And it looks at the place of fine art and non-fine art since the Enlightenment, and particularly in the period since the Second World War up to today.
Okay, thank you, François. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. And now I ask Francesco Martinelli to introduce himself.
I mainly work now in conservatories and Italian schools like Siena Jazz, where I teach history of jazz. Previous to that, I was worked in the diffusion of jazz culture in Italy, especially promoting festivals and organizing events. And now in Siena, I am also in charge of the Siena Jazz Archive, which is the biggest archival collection of materials about jazz in Italy. 2 years ago, I coordinated and edited a major, can I say, volume about the history of jazz in Europe with the support of Europe Jazz Network.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. And now it's the turn of George McKay. Please.
Thank you very much for having me here, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is George McKay, and I'm an academic in the UK who works mainly on popular music. That's what I've been researching for 30 years, something like that, 30 years now. My earliest books like Senseless Acts of Beauty, Cultures of Resistance since the 60s, and DIY Culture, Party and Protest in 90s Britain. They were about post-60s countercultures and the relationship between music and protest. And other books that I've written over the period since then include the one that will be of most interest, I guess, to EJN, Circular Breathing, The Cultural Politics of Jazz in Britain, which looked at the transatlantic relations and exchanges of jazz. I wrote a book called Radical Gardening. Come on, jazz and gardening, everyone loves it. And most recently, my most recent monograph was called Shaking All Over, Popular Music and Disability. I've also written about community music. That's perhaps where Francois and I kind of come together. And I've been involved in several EU-funded research projects around music and culture, music and social issues, including Rhythm Changes, which was the first large-scale funded Europe-wide project looking at the significance of jazz music. We were going to have our 10th anniversary conference in Amsterdam in September this year, but we've had to postpone it until next year because of coronavirus. And the other EU project I was involved in was called CHIME, Cultural Heritage and Improvised Music Festivals in Europe. And that's where I really worked closely with Francesco on working around festivals and jazz festival culture there. I'm currently nearly finished the Oxford Handbook of Punk Rock to show you that there is variety and variation in my popular music landscape.
Okay, thank you very much, George. Thank you for joining us. So before we start with the content, let's say, of the session, I would like to remind the audience and the followers that if they want to ask a question or simply write a comment, you can do it on the Europe Jazz Network social channels. So let's start with the presentation of François Matarasso. So Francois will explore the sociological side of the consequences of shocking and destabilizing events such as past wars and the current COVID-19, and he will explain or try to explain how artists help us live these difficult times, and eventually recover from them. So, Francois, I give you the floor, please.
Thank you, Francesca. There have been quite a lot of parallels made between the pandemic and wartime. When President Macron announced the lockdown in France, in the course of half an hour, he said 6 times, "We are at war." It's a controversial metaphor. It falls down in a number of respects, since we are fighting an invisible enemy if we're fighting anything. But I think it is useful in one respect. Certainly in my lifetime, I have never known anything that mobilized the whole of society the way that the public health response to the pandemic has done. So it has changed everything in the way that we are able to live and work and have our social life. I think it's interesting to look at parallels with the Second World War, because when EJN first talked to me about this, they talked about the effect of crises on the sector, but there wasn't really a jazz sector or even a music sector before the Second World War. Music making was essentially either a social activity or a commercial activity. It didn't involve the state, except in very narrow senses. But in the Second World War, the state very quickly realized 2 things. One was the importance of art and culture, and particularly music, in projecting an image of itself and in sustaining morale. And also it recognized that suddenly there were a lot of actors and musicians out of work. In the UK, 2 organizations were founded, the Council for Entertainment, Music and the Arts, and ENSA, the services, entertainments for services. CEMA in 1946 became the Arts Council of Great Britain and laid the foundations for public funding of the arts in the UK. And it's significant that CEMA, which was the, as I say, the Council for Music and the Arts, whereas the other body, which had a much more popular program, that was not carried on. Now, the relevance of this is twofold. Well, one is that the creation of the Arts Council and public funding of the arts was a direct consequence of the Second World War, both because the Second World War had mobilized the whole of the societies in meeting the challenges that the existential challenges they faced, and there was an enormous popular demand for some return on the suffering that populations had undergone. The return was the welfare state. So in Western Europe, France, Germany, the Netherlands, all of the relatively prosperous Western European countries began to put in place a welfare state, and culture became part of that. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc did its own version of that same thing. The other thing that I think is interesting is wartime is, among other things, a time of rapid change. Governments had realized the power of radio as a way to galvanize the population, and that continued in the post-war period with new technologies coming forward. Now, what is the relevance of that today? I think the situation that we are living through is comparable in the sense that it has thrown millions of artists and musicians out of work. All their sources of income, from teaching to performing to social events, have simply evaporated overnight. The social distancing rules mean that is likely to continue to be the case for quite a long time to come. Some teaching has gone online, but not everyone is suited and not everyone is able to teach music online. And those of you who are musicians will know better than me the limitations of that. The challenge, though, is that we, I think, also have expectations now. I think that governments, when they start to think about what will be the future of the cultural sector, at the moment, in almost every plan that I've seen, the reopening of theatres and cinemas and clubs is on the very last line of the plans, for obvious reasons. Partly because of the sense that, partly because of the health problems, but partly also, I suspect, because there's an unconscious sense that these are not so important. But they're, of course, immensely important to everybody who earns their living through there. Two other things are likely to be important and have parallels with the period after the Second World War. One is that we are going to have a much bigger state than we have had since the 1960s in most European countries. The state is necessarily investing in private organizations in an unprecedented way. The second is the parallel with radio and the new technology that is being explored and changing very fast, with that new technology, of course, being digital and the internet. We don't yet know how to earn a living through digital technology and the internet. Streaming music has been more of a problem to musicians than an advantage in financial terms. But I think we also have, I think we're likely to have two other things that make some parallel with the Second World War. One, I think, is that we will come out of this period with having undergone a considerable trauma, not the same trauma. How we have lived through this period will vary very significantly, depending on social class and economic position, our whether we have young children or elderly dependents, our own ages, and so on. But I think everybody will have been shocked, and I think it's not too strong to say traumatized by this experience, which has upset so much of what we expect and believed life to be about. The other big difficulty, or the parallel with the Second World War is we will come out with big expectations, and I think there will be some of those expectations will be positive in the sense that, as in 1945, there will be some of us, some of our populations, who will say, okay, we need a change of direction. We need a better, more just, fairer society than we have had, and perhaps also a more sustainable one. I think there may also be a response similar to 1945, which is a response of fear, which is about closing borders and control. It's important to recognize that if the welfare state emerged from the Second World War, so did the Cold War as well. Where does that leave musicians today? Inevitably, I'm afraid, in a period of great uncertainty. The economic model, which has sustained musicians for much of the last 40 or 50 years, is frayed, and it is not easy to see how it will be restored or when. The one positive thing I would say is that during the lockdown period, we have seen art and culture play an enormous part socially and in people's individual lives. And I think that the work that musicians can do in bringing people together and in helping people make sense of this traumatic experience and in helping them to find ways of connecting, as some musicians have already very cleverly done by using the internet, but finding new ways of connecting and making music perhaps in smaller groups in different ways. But the demand and the need for that music, I think, is going to be as great as ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. This is very interesting, and of course, many thoughts about what you said. And yes, the parallels are quite important. So now I would like to give the floor to Francesco Martinelli, who will talk about the social importance of jazz and other popular music forms on the big crisis phases. Francesco.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Francois, for your stimulating thoughts. And before going into the matter at hand, I would feel uncomfortable without saying anything about the current situation in the United States, the killing of the African-American man, George Floyd, that took place, and the following protest brought again to the forefront the issue of Black Lives Matters. And this is something that does not absolve us in Europe from our historical responsibilities, and also from the responsibility to the current situations of closing of the borders and exploitation of migrants in Italy and many other countries. So it's not a way of not taking our responsibility, but I would like all listeners to be aware and more aware of what happened, and how the music we are talking about comes from a huge depth of suffering, of exploitation, and of violent closing of sectors of the society. And in fact, what Francois said is connects very well with the subjects I wanted to take up. When African American music started to change the face of American popular music, so when first blues and then jazz started their diffusion into American culture. The music that was played and the words that were used had a strong social relevance. In blues, maybe the social commentary is not always open. Even sometimes it is very open, like in the great success of Bessie Smith Backwater Blues, which was commenting on one of the periodic inundations from the Mississippi River and on the social difficulties and poverty and the displacements that resulted from such events. But anywhere in that music, there is a component of overcoming obstacles in order to express themselves, or in order to achieve personal expression, and overcoming social barriers, social and racial difficulties. Even when the atmosphere of the music is smiling, is dancing, is rhythmic, there is a sense of liberation from different chains and different restraints, so to speak. And this happened again after the crisis of the end of the 20s, the Wall Street crash. Especially blues singers started to comment and to include in their verses a type of existential malaise, difficulty that was also an expression of social unrest. The culture of the nomadic, of the permanently moving worker along the rails, and even the difficulties of establishing a permanent network of personal relationship was a reflection of these social difficulties. And so in the 30s, yes, the music that we call jazz in a general way was also used as escapism, or just to keep the morale of the population high. But at the same time, there were, especially within the so-called race record production, plenty of music and words that were relevant to the social situation of the listeners, or the music itself. This happened again after the Second World War. In fact, we should not be surprised, because probably jazz, as many other popular music genres of the 20th century, was born out of a major crisis, and was born, in fact, in conditions that are quite similar to the condition of diffusion of a virus. Jazz, like tango, like son in Cuba, and music in many other countries, in Europe, in Greece, in African cities, was born in harbor towns with a migrant population from inside the continent, inside the nation, and international travel. And those are the same areas where deadly viruses, as the tragically famous or infamous flu of the 1918 and 19 became prevalent. After the Second World War, as Francois mentioned, the impact of the music was multiplied by public intervention, public subventions, and also technological changes. Popular music, as we know it, as we understand it today, or as we understood it for the past 50 or 60 years, is basically supported by the economy of reproduction of music through magnetic tape, vinyl records, and the diffusion of these media. And in Europe especially, we might say that jazz, after the Second World War, provided a kind of counterpoint, or a kind of forum for a continent where the ideas of union were becoming, if not prevalent, at least operative against nationalism. Jazz offered a platform for musicians to have a dialogue across borders. And when the Cold War started and then the Wall of Berlin was built, one of the first cultural events that went across the wall was the improvising music festivals. Once, I think Evan Parker said that Europe has been unified by the improvisers before politicians, before the political institutions. Because at that time, having musicians coming from the from the eastern section of the city to play together with the musicians who were from West Germany was quite a big thing, and going against the grain, so to speak, of the conception of both blocks. So we shouldn't be surprised that jazz has been able to deal with such major crises and to remain relevant in this crisis, to giving a contribution to popular music, which kept music relevant to generations after generation, and to insert also a little note of optimism in this, because we hope and we think that this crisis also will pass, even leaving a situation profoundly changed. I want to remember that the spike in births that came after the First World War, the Second World War, always generated also a spike in popular music, a new generation that created its own music, a new generation that created its own way of expression. And as always happens in popular culture is never a matter of one direction only messaging, one direction only communication. All generation, all classes, all social strata try to take control of what is offered to them, to produce their own message and to talk with their own generation. So I trust that this also will be happening with the young generation of today and the young generation of the future. Our sector, the jazz, and with jazz I mean a big area, hard to define, which includes dance music since the 30s and to this very day, includes experimental music, includes improvisation, includes very complex composition as well as very simple themes, and a complex set of practice that differ in the priorities from Western composed European music, in that the performer is always the center of the focus of the expression itself, and this might be the most important difference. This sector has always been contributing new material, new ideas, and new points of view to the general popular music sector. And this happened in the United States, all across the history of popular music, and this happened in Europe as well. Just think of the major impression and the major inspiration that experimental music from the very, fringe improvising sector of European music or European jazz, if you want to call it, the big impression and the big inspiration that sector represented for electronic music, techno music, pop acts that incorporated a number of innovation into their own acts and into their own music making processes. So I think that the past teaches us that musicians, improvising musicians, jazz musicians have the inbuilt, so to speak, capacity to create relevant music and to contribute generally to the relevant to the relevance of the music in general. Certainly, we are now in a situation where the means of diffusion of the music industry will be major change. And I think that, as everybody knows, digital will be a great part of it. But I see that digitization is not only making music online. It will mean a different way of promoting events. And even in my work as a teacher online, as Francois mentioned, I discovered a set of new limitations in teaching. But at the same time, with my students, I discovered a new set of possibilities that we might include, we might comprehend inside the teaching of the future. So I think that the crisis offers us also opportunities, and I see the resilience of the EJN associate that are already working to face the music and dance, so to speak, in the new changed world that we are entering now. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your observation, Francois.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. I think we all have a lot of questions in mind coming from your contribution, but we will talk more about that later. Now I would like to give the floor to George McKay. So George will talk today about some aspects of his research on jazz music and health, and with a focus on the periodic epidemics across the 20th century and their influence on jazz creativity. Please, George.
Thank you, Francesca. I want to pick up a little bit of the historical perspective around jazz, in particular, that Francesco also offered us a moment ago. That was great. Thank you very much. Both very stimulating sets of ideas, Francois and Francesco. And I want to think about jazz as both an enabling and as a disabling culture. And I want to sort of unpack that a little bit. Much of my work over recent years has been looking at the relationship between disability and music, and I've sort of extended that into thinking more about health, physicality, creativity, and how these things have complex relationships. So first of all, a little bit of a historical perspective on the idea of jazz as a disabling form. Okay, so jazz is the virus, jazz is the disease. The birth and early reception of jazz has been widely studied, and it includes nowadays lots of national studies of the way in which it was imported, adopted and adapted in local scenes and national scenes around the world, and in different countries through the first early decades of the 20th century. But also, at that time, in the 1920s and 30s, jazz was received as a problem, even as a health problem, as a disabling culture. And the disability argument against jazz starts from the idea of jazz as defective music because of its syncopated, abnormal rhythms. Much of that, it was unrhythmical. According to Robert L. Johnson, it was unrhythmical, discordant, and ultimately defective music. Jazz dancing reminded critics of the movements of people with epilepsy and nervous disorders. In the 1920s in the United States, jazz brought to the forefront debates about disease, disability, noise, and rhythm. And this is a kind of interesting early moment in jazz history. The UK's music scholar Laurie Strass has written of the way in which jazz has been condemned in explicitly pathological terms. So in its early reception, clear associations between jazz and disability were expressed by sociologists, physicians, music critics, musicians, and were promulgated in the specialist as well as in the popular press. So Strass has found things like newspaper headlines from the 1920s warning readers against and about the music's disabling dangers, So here's a headline, particularly for young women. Here's a headline: actress says jazz deforms girls' legs. Here's another one. In the context of pregnancy, jazz life may mean cripples, that you will have a deformed child if you're pregnant and you dance to that music. So in these very early decades, such anti-jazz discourse is sort of, produces a culmination around thinking of jazz as a disabling music from its very origins and its very start. And I want to focus in particular on a key set of moments, a set of epidemics of a particular condition, medical condition, which kind of happened through the globe in the 20th century. So very much this is a story, not exclusively, but very much is a story of 20th century medical and humanities interweaving. And if you think about the place of poliomyelitis, infantile paralysis, a condition which produced periodic epidemics in different cities and countries around the world through the 20th century until the introduction of vaccinations in the late 1950s. So there was an epidemic in New York in 1916, Los Angeles in 34, Berlin 47, Copenhagen 52. And then a few years after that, there's one in London. And these epidemics have a way of kind of inducing panic in the local population. Also, when the London epidemic took place, polio, people who had contracted polio, especially children, were brought into hospitals, and then the medical staff would start contracting polio as they treated them. And this was described by one doctor at the time as an absolutely terrifying situation. And polio, of course, one of the kind of key ways in which it functions is around respiratory problems. So there was a great push on things like ventilators, iron lungs, for instance. And you can begin to sense parallels with panic, with uncertainty, with a rush for vaccination, with a real pressure on treatment and on health equipment, and all of these kinds of things. Which made connections, I think, which offer us a sort of a kind of an echo, in some ways, of something like that, what we're going through now. So what? What's that got to do with jazz? Well, of course, we can think of a whole set of jazz musicians who are polio survivors who came through this in some way, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of that because it does, I think, allow us to consider the relationship between health, disease, creativity and music making. And what this does is, I think, if we think about a set of musicians, so we could look at anyone from Connie Boswell, the singer, to Charlie Hayden, the bassist, Horace Parlan, the pianist, Dave Liebman, saxophone player, David Sanborn, saxophone player, and Carl Perkins, not Blue Suede Shoes, the West Coast jazz pianist in the 1950s. All of these, Joni Mitchell, kind of moving from jazz into jazz folk kind of thing. All of these are polio survivors. And all of these have a way of sort of exploring or negotiating or understanding and coming to terms with and their own health experience and impairment as a result of their condition and the way that influenced their music making. And this also speaks to jazz, because jazz, we can begin to understand it is a generous music and a music which makes space for the physically differently embodied. And that's an important aspect, I think, because sometimes we think we don't necessarily look at jazz as inclusiveness and its generous spirit, and yet this is a very important aspect, I think, of that. If you look at a couple of musicians like Horace Parlan, Charles Mingus's pianist from the 1950s, or David Sanborn, both of these musicians were encouraged to take up their instruments in childhood as an element of their physiotherapy and recovery. So for each of them, it's arguable that a successful musical career came about because, rather than in spite of, the childhood disease. In this instance, reading it like this, we can see how music originates as a therapeutic response to symptoms of the medical condition. And I think that also is quite an important way of looking at and thinking about the possibilities of jazz. Joni Mitchell, the Canadian singer-songwriter, you know, again worked with Mingus, and then with Mingus's music, you know, she had to adapt her guitar technique because of her limited muscularity, because of her attenuated physicality. And she said, my left hand is somewhat clumsy because of polio. I can simplify the shapes of the left hand, but I craved chordal movement, and I wanted and I wanted complexity in my music making. So she adapted and she found a new way of playing. And lots of musicians with impairments have found jazz an accommodating musical space in which to be differently embodied, in which to be disabled. Mitchell said, in the end, good thing I couldn't play standard technique because of polio, because it came out original. And that idea of originality in the music making, I think, is an important one for us, because I'm reminded here of ways in which, well, we can think of jazz as a generous, inclusive form at its best, which has wanted and been able to accommodate the differently embodied and differently minded, because jazz was capable of flexibility and it sought novelty. And because jazz was a music forged in the experience of oppression, resistance and liberation in all of these kinds of ways. And I'm reminded of the argument of the American scholar Alex Lubet, who's written wonderfully about jazz and disability. And Lubet said a few years ago, it is clear that jazz is a music within which artists with physical disabilities are able to pursue or continue their careers. This owes to the nature of jazz virtuosity, which does not simply permit, but demands personal idiosyncrasy. And that's a sort of, you know, a way of thinking about jazz as a enabling musical culture. And there again, I wanted to, a bit like Francesco, you know, wanted to kind of end on a rising note with something more positive for us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, George. This is very interesting, and most of all, it's like it's stunning the strength of the creativity of the artists who in these really difficult times, also in physical disease, they found the strength to adapt and create. So before starting with some questions, I'd like to remind the audience and the followers that if they want to make a question or ask a question or just comment on what you have said, they can write. And we will ask the question to our panelists. But meanwhile, I have a question for you from what I heard and inspired from what you said. My question is, compared to the artist's response to this big crisis of the past, my question is, what do you see now? What is the situation now? Of course, maybe it's too early to say that, because of course we are still under the pandemic. But still, what do you see now? How artists are behaving, or are starting to behaving, or have behaved so far? So are they starting to react in a creative way, or are they just, some of them, complaining, or are they trying to push themselves and push and encourage the creativity? So again, maybe it's too early to say that, but what do you see now?
Well,
So,
I think that, I mean, jazz is a collective form, right? It's a dialogic form. It's about speaking between people, and then it has, usually it has a kind of liveness to it as well. And those are pretty difficult things to kind of put across at the moment. But jazz is also an isolating, solitary form, You know, there's a practice in jazz called woodshedding, which is precisely about isolation. So you go out, you go away from the scene, and okay, it might be to recover from some narcotizing condition that you have, but it's also to do with working on your technique, honing your instrument, and so on. And that kind of dialectic, if you like, between the isolated on the one hand and the collective on the other is an important one. And we shouldn't lose sight, I think, of the possibility that jazz at the moment can also have a sort of isolating benefit. You know, maybe when people come back, they'll have even more things to say and even more intriguing ways to say them on their individual instruments.
I think it's really interesting. I loved listening to both George and Francesco and getting some insight into the adaptability and flexibility of jazz, which may well equip it as a form better than some other musical forms to change in the new circumstances. I have two questions that I'm asking myself. One is, I think certainly some artists are responding by doing all sorts of things. I saw a very, very amusing video of a musician who calls himself Elton Wrong, who can't play indoors now, and so has built a motorized piano and is driving around playing to people in the streets. So one of my questions is whether this means anything, whether it's just a temporary response to a temporary situation. The other question is whether I trust the artists and the musicians to respond imaginatively and flexibly and creatively to new conditions, because that's exactly what both George and Francesco have talked about in their different ways. But I wonder whether the sector, the institutions that have grown up in the 70 years since public funding came in, has a similar capacity for adaptability, and whether actually it's the sector which will slow down the ideas that musicians have for how they will play concerts differently, teach differently. So I think there is an interesting tension there between the institutional structure, which seems so important because it's what pays everyone and puts things on. But it may, of course, it's never the important things. It's not the concert hall that matters. It's the musician in the concert hall. And we may have to untangle that because otherwise if we care too much about trying to protect some of those ancillary things that seem so important because they're physical, like concert halls, then we may end up misplacing our energy.
Yeah. Francesco, do you want to respond? Because I've got something to say to that, but do you want to come in first?
Yes, I would like to say something quickly to make a parallel with a different sector. The pandemic crisis made a huge, how can we say, a huge fault line in the energy sector. The energy sector will not be the same again. It's not only because there's less consumption of energy during the lockdowns in the different cities, but there is a major change in the market. The recovery of in energy production will not be the same as before. So the old normal of oil and coal has been the change from that has been accelerated by the pandemic crisis, and this is something that you see in all the markets and all the investment. Spain just announced that it's going away from fossil fuels for good, and there would be no further financing of fossil fuels. So there is an ecology of listening as well. And jazz musician has always been on the forefront of that, exploring space with music. While, of course, the classical Western music and the opera, they require their own very rigid structure. And there are a few instances of virus diffusion through musical practices recently, and they were all related to choir practice in church. And huge number of people breathing and strongly breathing together in a not a big space. So jazz has been at the forefront, as George McKay mentioned, the Chime Project, exploring the heritage with even small ensemble, small groups, small audiences in specific places, which might be very well suited to the new conditions that we are in. So I see this creativity displaying even more in the future.
Yeah, that's really, both of those are very interesting points. I want to pick up a little bit in that too. Right, okay, I'm a fan basically of jazz, that's why I write about it. And then, but I don't really want to go to a concert hall to see jazz. Best jazz doesn't happen in concert halls. Good jazz happens in a little club somewhere that might not have too much public funding. It might have no public funding. And so the cultural infrastructure, is a sort of, it's a kind of, seems to me like it ought to be a second level issue for a lot of jazz organizations and jazz musicians, not necessarily the ones who maybe teach in universities or conservatoires, but here's another provocation. Is that the most interesting jazz anyway, the stuff coming out of a conservatory? And so if we take out the concert halls and the conservatoires, that's the kind of public funding side of it. But jazz is still going to thrive because it's an improvised form where lots of the most interesting things happens in a small scale, low-key, DIY sort of set of spaces and set of practices. And that ought to be something that could thrive afterwards, and perhaps be the beginning of a new scene. So that's my kind of response to that. And there's also a question. Are there parallels between the sort of negative representation ideas of jazz and the extinction or eradication of fusion in the late 80s? And Korea has in the last couple of months invited us into his rehearsing space. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So so the second point about watching musicians rehearse might be very interesting, because depending on their rehearsals, is their rehearsal kind of based around improvisatory modes and skills and practices? If so, that might be us halfway towards some new, intriguing, original music. That might be a really great thing to kind of experience and see some ideas being sort of made up, worked through, and then possibly jettisoned or abandoned because it didn't quite happen. So that would be really interesting. Are there parallels between jazz in the early negative side of it as represented and fusion in the late 80s? Oh, I don't know. Maybe that is a taste. I mean, there are parallels in terms of it being a taste issue, and but then, of course, jazz has got 60 or 80 years behind it, and so fusion becomes the latest thing that's kind of being rebelled against, I suppose. A sort of slightly tighter structure, a clearer kind of set of rhythms, and then we're away from free music into something a bit more danceably acceptable, maybe with more straightforward melodies and a bit of electronica in it too. So that doesn't sound quite so sort of freaky, leaky, or squeaky as the sort of jazz that might come out of a kind of body which is weirdly disabled and disabling in some other sort of way. And that's the kind of jazz I quite like to listen to personally.
We have another question.
Yeah. Yes, we have a question, but it's more regarding the current measures, let's say. It says, in Switzerland, culture got a big support from the state like never before in history. And as I can see in Germany too. Is that the same in Italy and other places? So how you think about that? I'm wondering what happens when clubs are open again and people, then it's cut. But yeah.
I don't know. I don't think I don't feel to be in a position to comment on that, because I'm not too much aware of such support and the way that it's been operated. I only can confirm that, in my opinion, it will be difficult even for the clubs to continue to operate in the same way. And I think that the creativity will have to extend, as George said, to the ways of presenting the music in different contexts. But this is a wide open field, as far as I can understand, that we are just basically just entering into.
There is interesting research that's been done by a Birmingham-based company called Indigo, which you would find online. They have surveyed something like 85,000 regular arts attenders from 190 organizations. So it's a very big sample. And I don't remember the precise figures, but there's very strong sense that people are missing live shows, but there's also something like, I think it was only 19% are booking for things, and they're booking for things in November. And there's, of all of the situations that they are most anxious about entering into, it's a standing space, a typical club, where you would not feel you were able to protect yourself from being close to other people. I think who knows, but my sense is our governments have, a lot of people are frightened, and it will take a long time for people to build the confidence to want to go into a crowded space. And that's where the imagination and the creativity comes in. The nice thing about, seems to me, as a non-musician, you don't have to have your band sitting in each other's lap. You can spread them out a bit more, and you can spread the audience out a bit more. And it may be that possible to do more things, but for fewer people, as part of the confidence building process.
Yeah, I think that those are really interesting observations. And, maybe it's just the gigs I go to, or even worse, play at, right? But they're not usually overloaded with an audience. Do you know what I mean? So often the audience is quite sparse anyway. So maybe that now has become our benefit. And then so that's one thing. I think as well, what it does is it shows us jazz's sort of slightly ambivalent positionality. It's between, on the one hand, classical music in concert halls, and then commercial pop music. So if I want to go and see a band again at a gig, with 1,000 other people and then a good rock band on stage, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm not even sure when that's going to come back. I was talking with my co-editor of the Oxford Handbook, the punk rock one I mentioned earlier. I was talking with her the other day, and she said, maybe we're history, George. Maybe what we're looking at and writing about, whether it's festivals or those kinds of rock gigs, maybe they're now becoming a historical event, and we must immediately begin to historicize them and think from that perspective. So I don't feel jazz, mostly in jazz concert settings, is quite in that sort of stark position. I do think that, that cabaret seating and then spaces where the musicians are set a bit apart, good sound system, and all of those things can help and can be a benefit within improvisation. I would just say one other little thing that I haven't seen. I mean, I haven't looked across the entire internet endlessly, but I haven't seen lots and lots of efforts at, say, loose or free improvised music happening online between musicians in different contexts. You might think that would be a real thing that improvised music could have and take this opportunity to happen. Francesco, do you have a view there?
We talked about this with musicians, but the thing is that currently the technical issues are quite demanding. And in fact, what happened is that the lag, the answering times are so widely varying. They're not even constant over a number of minutes or half an hour. So as we see now between us, and it is very difficult. What happened? The Chicoria mentioned initiative. It happened that musicians were able to show things that maybe normally they can't. Musicians, for example, try to create something outside of showing details of their performance that they can't show normally to an audience, which is sitting even a few feet away. But with cameras, they can get really, close and show the gesture, or several cameras on different points of the instruments. And there was a lot of the display of creativity. And I noticed that for musicians teaching playing, it was almost impossible to play with the students. But the respective showing could show details that were sometimes easier to show online that in person in front of the class. So there are possibility there, and certainly George said a very true thing. There are plenty of huge spaces where to play music, where jazz is possible to be played more than other music, because of course there is also a climate thing. But I think of festivals in Sardinia and everywhere where they have huge spaces outside, and they can sit 500 people, but they can see them far away because they are in a natural valley or something like that. So I think that jazz will have to make use of all the historical resources, from street bands in New Orleans to solo performances in art galleries to make use of what is presented to its day.
Here.
Okay, so thanks also, Francesco. And we have now another 2 comments. So I just read them, and then if you want to comment on this, it's maybe jazz or music performers are forced to leave the big concert venues and return to the clubs. So the Half Note, Café Bohemia, and Slugs were all clubs that made the development of the music leap forward. That is where innovation took place and musicians experimented. So this is a comment. Do you have comments on this comment? Or
Well, it sounds like what we've been saying a bit, with some very specific examples. And then if that's what musicians and organizers are thinking themselves, then maybe indeed that is the way forward, and the way things will happen.
Providing that the image of the smoky and unventilated jazz club has to go if you want people to come in.
Talking to jazz musicians who play in on the rural touring circuit in England, one of the things that was really interesting was that several of them spoke about having more freedom playing in a village hall, because the audience had no expectations. The audience didn't know who they were, so they could play what they wanted. Whereas sometimes if they played in a jazz festival, then the audience knew them and didn't like if they deviated from what they expected them to play. So maybe that's some of the freedom that will come again when jazz musicians play outside their usual spaces.
Okay, so let's see what happens. And there is another comment. Shouldn't just carry on and perhaps even strengthen its role as a cross-border creative form of connecting cultures? Many, including promoters, talk about walls between countries being raised post-COVID. Shouldn't be jazz's role to break those walls?
Here, I totally agree, and that is somehow we even started from that in our comments. So I totally agree with that. And Europe Jazz Network has always been in the forefront of that type of work, with connecting people in festival and musicians, and offering chances to young musicians to cooperate, and with other schemes that are related to Europe, especially with the Erasmus exchanges of students. So I totally subscribe to that comment and observation.
Well, with your caveat that you mentioned a moment ago in your last observation, Francesco, that we need to bear in mind, if we just reintroduce international touring, what are the environmental implications of that? And if jazz is mainly a small scale music, and then often it's more interesting because of that. That's just my personal view. And then maybe that smallness doesn't want to be traveling around the world and adding to kind of environmental problems. Maybe we need to try and think of different ways of that jazz can maintain connecting cultures across borders. That seems really important, and part of its historic legacy, if you like, the transatlantic migration that is then kind of reorganized as well through mass media organizations in the early 20th century, and then jazz moving into other countries all around as a result of that. So, we must keep that part of it, but we also need to think a bit about environmental issues, I think, for international touring players.
Absolutely, I think that major tours were started. I think there will be some interesting research on that in connection with the changing technology of intercontinental travels. If you remember the cover of Dave Brubeck's Eurasia tour, it was the Pan-American jets, the new way of traveling in a short time without a stopover in Iceland, was a major propaganda aspect of those tours. So that has to change, and maybe some people already started to discuss this in festivals, inviting less musicians, staying for a longer times, interacting with local audience more. And we already have models. Paris Festival, Banlieue Bleu, and Cheltenham, many other places tried, Sardinia again, they tried similar models. So less, huge, mega international profile, and more grassroots works, even with big artists working with local communities. That's one of the certainly of the way to go, and also to answer some of the environmental issues that we all have.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, actually. And what another thing that would allow us to address might be the slight sense that now we nostalgize, right? If you look even back a couple of years, you look at the jazz festival headliners across a lot of major European jazz festivals, it's the same artists, and so you go from one country to the next, and it's like, oh, jazz just means these four artists, these four headliners, and they play every European country in the summer. And that, frankly, is a little bit boring, even homogenizing. And, it gives kind of grist to the mill that actually jazz sort of kind of all sounds the same because, we see the same names regularly at each festival. That would be a very nice way of continuing to revive festivals and make them have that sense of rootedness and situatedness that sometimes jazz music isn't quite so good at because of its international, transatlantic, global claims.
And the other side of that is that there's the dissatisfaction of artists being whisked from one place to the other without never having time to get in touch with any of the local cultures. Yeah. And many of them were unhappy of that. B.B. King, was famous for buying records all over the place and bringing them at home. And now his collection is in the University of Mississippi, and it's fantastic. He was going to Yugoslavia and buying folk traditional music LPs in order to satisfy his curiosity, which he didn't have time to satisfy while he was there. So a longer stay and a better interaction, even with major artists, could be really the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a topic we will have one of the next Europe Jazz Network webinar, actually on the 4th of June, and the title of this webinar will be "A House is Not a Home." And the question is, will closed borders mean closed minds? So we will discuss in depth about this on June the 4th. So it looks like we are running out of time. So I would like, first of all, to thank you all. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks for your contribution. I would like to thank the audience, and I would like to thank my colleagues and EJN staff and technical crew today, Battista and Stefano. And I would like to remind you and everybody that on Monday, June the 1st, there will be another Europe Jazz Network webinar. The title is "Everything Must Change." And this is about, has the crisis actually improved our online offer to the audience? or offer to the audience in general. And so we will explore the possible digital scenarios post-COVID-19, so live streaming and monetization, new opportunities, and for online audience engagement and socialization. So we will have moderator Anna Ambima from the UK, and as speakers Christoph Huber, Nathan Newman, Karin Zuber, Reza Akbarali, and Helen Schönartz. So join us, and thank you again, everybody. Bye-bye, and have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.